An object is a really hard thing to understand because it's really abstract, because it can be pretty much anything. But the core thing behind an object is that it is some data and then methods that always work on the data, and we want to store them together. So for example, a USB could be an object. It has like a size, it has a name, it has a color, and then there might be some things that we might want to do with it, like store things on it, and that would be the methods. It might be like an ancient Sumerian tablet. So the data might be the things that are written on it. Right down here, it tells us who did the witnessing of the tablet. That sort of thing would be the data. The methods might be reading it, it might be turning it over, it might be holding it, it might be storing it. That might be a method that would be associated with the tablet. I know, you might have a crayon. A crayon has like an RGB value. It has its name and different things. That would be the data. Some methods you might want to do with it is you might want to color, or you might want to peel off the wrapper. So again, we're associating those two things together. Another way to think about an object is that an object is a type. So objects allow us to make our own types in Java. Let's take a look at some of the types we learned back when we started Java. So we learned double, and I would classify that as a primitive type, one that comes in Java pre-made. Whereas something like an image view is something that a programmer created that's much more complicated than a double. It has images and sizes, and then it has all the methods, like how you can set the image resource, that makes it much more complicated than just a double. Int was another example of a primitive type, whereas a text view is another example of an object. A char is another example of a primitive type, and a file output stream is another example of an object. We can read and we can write and flush and all those other things with this object. Another example of a primitive type was a Boolean. And then a last one, which I think might be a little tricky for you, is a string. A string is actually an example of an object. And if you recall, we actually did a unit where we learned a whole bunch of string methods like replace and those kinds of things, and that's what differentiates them. So something I want you to think about, the ones in this pile, is that they all have small letters at the beginning of their name. And in this pile, they all have capitals. And in Java, the convention to distinguish between primitive types and objects or complex types is the capital letter at the beginning of the name. Another thing that differentiates them is that all of the ones in this pile test equality using equals equals. And the ones in this pile have to use things that are more complicated, like dot equals, to do it. Another thing is that in this pile, we can change the values by saying equals. And we can get at the values by just pulling the variable's name out. But in this pile, we use set text and we used get text. So because they're complicated types, to go in and change them, we use gets and sets, and we use dot equals. And over here, we can do everything very simply because it's simply a primitive type. So what we're going to be learning to do in this unit is we're going to be learning how to make our own objects and our own complicated types so that we can use them in our programs and that other people can use them as well. So in this unit, with objects, the user of our object is another programmer. It isn't actually a regular user anymore. It's going to be someone else on our programming team. And that's an important distinction. These are the 4 basic types of methods inside objects. We've studied them before, but I'd like to review them again. So the constructor sets up memory. Its keyword is new. The accessor gets into memory and finds out what's there, and that's gets. The mutator is going to change memory. We use sets to do that. And the facilitator is a brand new one we've never learned before, and it's essentially everything else. If you're programming in a team, these 2 are the easy breezy ones. You give them to the weak members of your team. This one's a bit more tricky sometimes, and these ones are always tough. So these always goes to the top member of your team. So let's take a look at some old code that we've looked at before, and let's try to classify the methods. So let's take text views. So a text view, we might say new text view in our onCreate method, and that would be a constructor. And then we might say set text, and a set text changes around what text is on the screen. That's a mutator. And get text is an accessor. It allows us to find out what was in the text view. Let's take a look at, let's say, the intents. So we had code to make a new intent. That was a new screen. Well, new, that's constructor. So that would make us a new screen. And then we had the code to start an activity. That was quite a complex task, so that was a facilitator. All right, let's take a look at image views. All right, so we had new image view. So that is going to be, if I want to make a new image view, well, new constructor. Set the image resource. Okay, that's a set, so that's going to change the image in our image view. Get ID. This would maybe get the ID of the thing that was clicked on. So that's going to be an accessor. Set on click listener. Set, we're going to be changing what the on click listener is. Set enabled, we're going to be changing the status of the enabledness. Okay, we also did strings. So there's actually a constructor new string. We never used it, but it does exist. All right. And then there's this crazy method toString. And toString, according to the rules I gave you, is a facilitator, but it's the only one that breaks the rules. toString is an accessor, and it allows us to find out what's in a string. It's the only one that doesn't fit the pattern I gave you. Replace, a string function, that one is a facilitator. Equals, facilitator. Compare to, facilitator. Okay, we also did files. So we had input files yesterday. So open file input, well, that doesn't have a new set or get, so it's a facilitator. Close, not new set or get, so close is a facilitator. Read, ditto, facilitator. Okay, so those are how you can classify some methods.